presenter we have for our Safety Moment webinar is Brent Okeson. He's going to talk to us about our top 10 problems. Brent.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Going to talk about some top 10 things that we've been seeing in the past year as we come around the state and do assessments and SARs. These are the top 10 things that we're seeing as we go around, and so we thought it would be a good idea just to summarize, what are these top 10 things that are the most reoccurring, and maybe that will be beneficial to our members out there that as we talk about these things, maybe something stands out that you want to watch for and something that you want to look for. So as we go through today, I'm going to have several presentations with pictures here, and these pictures come from our different visits that we've done around the state. And so as we go through, we just want to talk about these most common hazards, things that are really happening out there, and we're going to have a checklist that we can send out after this that shows these top 10 things that you can use to go around your facilities and your properties and areas in the cities and towns and just make sure that these things are taken care of. So as we go through, that's the goal of this today. And we're going to count these down. We're going to go from 10 on down to 1, counting down the top 10 of what we're seeing. So number 10 here being the first one would be hazard communication. So we're seeing, we got chemicals in the workplace. Maybe they're missing labels. Sometimes there's secondary containers where we'll take one liquid and put it into another container, and sometimes we're not seeing a label on there, and you don't want to get those things mixed up. So labeling is one of those things that we're seeing. Also around the hazard communication side of it would be the SDS book or the SDS sheets. There's the new format now, so there needs to be the written program with a list of chemicals and needs to be available for the employees to reference to. So the new program, which is the Global Harmonization System, is now in place, and there's new terminology, there's new formats, and so we just want to encourage all of you to make sure that you have the current SDS sheets for each of the chemicals in your workplace. And then with that, there's the training requirements. Make sure that your employees understand what's needed to understand the hazards of working with different chemicals and things in the workplace. So watch for those things relating to hazard communication.
Hey, Brent, just 1 second on that one. Sorry, I told him I wasn't going to jump in, but we will be having a webinar on hazard communication. We've got another deadline coming up. I should have looked that up. I think it's June 1st again. But the full implementation needs to happen this year, and so we'll be doing another webinar just prior to that, give you enough time to hopefully put the last things in place prior to that deadline for OSHA compliance. Thanks.
Yep, thanks for that. Number 9 would be our next topic here, and this relates to eye wash stations and the emergency shower areas. And so what we've seen, sometimes there's some obstructions. People are putting things in the way, stacking materials or other objects that are left in the way that might limit access to that if there was an emergency and you had to get your eyes washed out or get chemical rinsed off of you. And so make sure those areas are clear. Do regular inspections on those. Make sure that they're ready to go. There was one time I was at a facility this year, and I pulled the caps off the eye wash station just to see if it would work, and I hit the little valve, and out comes the water, and the water was, really dirty, brown, kind of corroded water. And so it was an indication that hadn't been checked for quite some time. And so it's important that you check those regularly. It's a weekly requirement that you do that, and do an inspection, document it that you're doing that, and that way you can have that water, eye wash and chemical shower ready to go if needed. So watch for those. Here's an example of a chemical shower. You want to keep those areas clear just like we talked about, and have them ready to go. So the next one, down to number 8, is our compressed gas cylinders. And we see a lot of hazards with this. Particularly one thing is the not being restrained. You can see in the picture here on this slide how there's a chain holding those up against the wall, and that's great. You just don't want to leave those out where they could tip over, knock a valve off, have some type of a real hazard involving those. So make sure they're restrained and secured. If you're moving them around, have them on the carts, have them chained on the cart, and keep them in good areas where they're out of the way. They're not going to be bumped into by other things or equipment, and good storage area for those. One thing to watch for is your separation of oxygen and acetylene bottles. We see this sometimes. They're stored in the same areas, and they're obviously something that are you want to take some real caution with. They recommend that you have these at least 20 feet apart or separated by a fire-rated barrier. So recognize that in your workshops and different places you have the cylinders. Keep those things separated, keep them chained up and restrained. Number 7 is our next one, and this is pertaining to railings on stairways and mezzanines. And so it's important to have guardrails up where needed. You can see on this picture how, there's boxes and things stacked up on top of the mezzanine, and there's no protection from falling. So there really should be a guardrail on a situation like this with a top rail at 42 inches. Should have a mid-rail and toe boards to keep things from falling off the edges and onto people below. And so you want to watch for that. One thing you need to ensure is that if you do have guardrails, whatever material it's made out of, it needs to support at least 200 pounds. So watch for that. Here's an example of a really good one. This is a nice railing they've got up along the top there. Obviously, you can see it's going to keep people from falling over, and it's got some toe board at the bottom that will keep objects from falling below. So that's a really good example. And remember that these guardrails can be made out of any material as long as they can hold that 200 pounds. It could be out of lumber, could be out of pipe or chain or anything, cable, as long as it's supportive and built to the right dimensions. So watch for those. Number 6, being our next one, is combustible, flammable storage. A lot of times people will stack things and put boxes and papers and combustible things in areas, and they often don't think about hazards that may go along with that. Well, here in this picture, you've got a bunch of things stored in front of an electric panel, blocking the storage. And if you think about the fire triangle, where you have to have a fuel source, an oxygen source, and an ignition source, you don't want to keep a lot of combustible products gathered up where you could cause a potential fire. So be careful with those things around your electric service areas, mechanical rooms, near furnaces and heaters, and obviously not to block exits and access to things that you need to get to. So watch your storage for materials and things like that in the workplace. This next one here, this is our safety cans. We've seen some things with this where, here you have one that's damaged, missing lids, maybe the lids aren't working properly. So always check that out and make sure they're stored in the right areas. And then as it goes with flammables, if you have 5 gallons of flammable liquids of any type in accumulation, 5 gallons or more, then it would need to be in a flammable cabinet. So watch for that. Your aerosol cans, any flammable liquids, fuels, things like that. If you've got 5 gallons or more, make sure that they're in the cabinets. And then if you were to ever have a fire, this is number 5 here, you'd want to make sure that your fire extinguishers are ready to go. So we've got an example here, great picture. They've got a space marked for the fire extinguisher. They've got a really good sign identifying the location, but we're missing the fire extinguisher, right? And so that's one of the things you want to make sure in your facility is, are the fire extinguishers where they need to be? Are they ready to use? And check that out. That's one of the things that we see regularly. And just because it's there doesn't mean it's necessarily ready to work. So check the gauge on those things. If you see in this picture, perhaps the pin's been pulled before or it's just undercharged, but you can see that yellow arrow on the gauge is just to the left of that green area on the gauge. And so you want to check for that. Make sure that it's not overcharged or undercharged. You want to have enough charge there that way if there is a fire, you can get to it and take care of it if you need to. So do an inspection on your extinguishers. Make sure that they have their annual certification, which this is an example of that with the tag. It'll have a punch on the tag for the month and the year that it's been inspected. And so every year you get this inspected by perhaps your fire department or perhaps an outside vendor, and they'll come around and do a full inspection on it and make sure that that equipment is in good shape, that the extinguisher is ready to go and ready to use, that it's charged properly. So do those. And then also a monthly inspection is something that you should do around your facility, just to check all your fire extinguishers, make sure that their gauge is in the right area, that they're ready, that they're fully charged, that the tamper seal's not broken, pins are in place, mounted, and available, ready to use. And this is an example of that, where you do a monthly inspection where you would just initial that on the fire extinguisher. So always check for those things. Again, if there was a fire, you'd want to have it available. You wouldn't want to have to look around for it and have problems finding the things that you needed. So that's another thing we've been seeing regularly throughout the state. Counting down again, number 4 is our next item, and this is machine guarding. So you can see in this picture there's some open parts of the machine and the equipment where it could be rotating or catching you in, and those areas are what really need to be guarded. So don't remove the guards from equipment. Make sure that they're put in place and secured And that's really there to protect you from any nip points or rotating parts, or keep things from flying off and hitting you or getting entangled in. So that's what they're there for. Make sure the guards are in place on your equipment. As you go around, one of the things that we see a lot with machine guarding is our grinders. We see a lot of issues with grinders. They get used a lot, especially in workshops and other areas, and they're important to keep maintained and keep adjusted properly. So one of the things we see are the guards. Perhaps the guards are missing or broken. They're just not doing what they need to do. And the tool rest, you'll see in the picture the rest where the material will lie on when you're working on it. That tool rest needs to be adjusted to be within 1/8 of an inch of the wheel. And that's important so that things don't get caught and jammed in there and cause things to come flying off. So check your tool rest, and then the tongue guard, which is at the top of the wheel, is an adjustment that needs to be within 1/4 inch. And again, those adjustments are there for a reason. It's to protect you and to use the equipment properly. One thing, if you think about it, is you're working on a grinder, sometimes you have to push the material you're working on into the grinder, and so you don't want that to be moving around on your workbench. Keeping it anchored, keeping it secure, bolted down is really important. That way it doesn't move on you as you're working with it. And then when it comes to personal protection, make sure you've got safety glasses and goggles available, but also you need to have a full face shield over the top of your glasses and goggles. And that's really there to protect you from the flying parts and pieces and material that could come flying off. So check those things. Those are some common things we've been seeing throughout the year is on the grinders. Also on machine guarding, drill presses. Here's an example of equipment that might tip over. Sometimes it's a little top heavy. You want to make sure that it's secured down to the floor and that it won't move on you as you're using it. So check for those things. One of the newer things that OSHA is looking at is these chuck guards, and these go on the drill presses. You can see there's this little clear protective barrier that will fold down as you put your material under. You can fold that down, and it really protects the point of operation so that you don't get caught up in it and don't get tangled in it as it's rotating. So those are something you can add on to your drill presses, or you can get it from the manufacturer to fit your machine. So check for those. They're really there for your protection. They're there to prevent accident and injury, and it's for everybody's best interest to do that.
Hey, Brent, we have a question. What about portable grinders?
Portable grinders, they also have guards on them. Yeah, so you want to make sure that those guards are in place. Make sure they're inspected. Make sure that the discs and the wheels on there are in good shape. Definitely do a good inspection on that. And, definitely don't remove those guards. It can be a real problem there. So watch for those things. Good question.
And wear a face shield when you're using those portable grinders.
And face shield, correct. Wear the PPE. Yep. All right, counting down number 3, we have a lot of slip and trip hazards, and this is common. There's lots of injuries that comes from slips and falls, and what we're looking here for is any unexpected depressions. This could be in any working surface, maybe in a shop, maybe in an office building, and that includes any difference in elevation change of 1/4 inch or more. So that could be on a sidewalk where you have a 1 inch drop off, or any type of walkway or working surface. You want to watch for those dips and places where it might shift or cause a problem there that you could trip on. So do an inspection around your work areas and watch for those. The other thing we see is housekeeping. So you look in this picture, if you had to get over to that table there or back into the file cabinet, it's going to be hard to get around things because you got to step over boxes and equipment and materials and tools. And so keeping things clear, keeping them stored up properly and on shelves and out of the way is really an important thing to prevent injury. So make sure you're keeping clear paths, good access around your work areas. And this pertains to cords and hoses. You don't want to have those strung out going across walkways where you have to step over them or could get caught and tripped over them. So coil those up, keep them where they need to be, and keep the areas clear. Leaks and spills and wet surfaces is another thing that leads to slipping in the workplace. So, if you have oil that spills or water that spills on the floor, whatever it is, make sure that it gets cleaned up and keep a good working surface there in your areas. We've had a lot of claims of injuries involving 3 points of contact where people are climbing in and out of equipment, going up and down ladders, stairways, whatever it is. It's important to maintain those 3 points of contact because it can keep you from falling down and getting hurt more severely. So check for those. Watch for your slips, trips, and falls. It's always a big thing to watch for in the work areas. Counting down, we're down to number 2 now. These are some of the bigger things that we're seeing, really critical things that we're seeing is on play structures, where you have common areas with parks and where children play. You could have some really big hazards for that. And what we want to look for is the number 1 killers, which are the head entrapments and the entanglement hazards. So, you know, you take a kid to the park and you think it's all fun and they're having a good time, but sometimes there's really some hidden dangers and hidden hazards there that you have to watch for. And as an example of those is the openings of railings, watching where kids could get their head into. Maybe parts have come loose, maybe bolts are not tight, maybe the components have worn out and changed over time. And looking for those types of things can cause real problems. Kids can get caught up in it. Their clothing can get caught on protruding bolts and different components. And so it's really important that you check for those things, because you can't imagine how bad it would be if something bad happened there. So look at your play structures, make sure that there's none of those hazards and that it's built to the right specifications. And here's an example of that in a play zone where you have your use zones on a play structure. So typically it's about 6 feet or more of a use zone that you need to have from where your play structure is to where the adjacent surfaces are, or other equipment or pieces of the play structure. And so in this picture you can see there's the blue platform where kids could come off of there. Well, you've also got some concrete and some curbing, looks like possibly within 6 feet of the play area. And what happens is if those kids were to fall and hit those other surfaces, that could lead to further injury. So you want to maintain a good clearance around all equipment, swings and slides and all the play structures, and it's typically about 6 feet or more depending on the potential height of the fall. So check those things out. And then at playgrounds too, we see this quite frequently is the impact attenuating material, which is either your wood chips or rubber mulch or other material out there. You want to make sure that's in place. A lot of times at the bottoms of slides and in the areas of swings, these wood chips and material gets kicked out of the way. And it's important that you maintain that, because if a kid were to fall on it, you need a good amount of material to support that fall. Otherwise, the surface is going to be a lot harder. They're going to have much greater injury from the impact. And so check those areas. Make sure that you have a good amount of material. It's usually about 9 to 12 inches deep. And you want to rake those back into place and refill them as needed so that there's not further injury from those playground areas there. So do an inspection on those. Also regarding play structures, we see sometimes some outdated equipment, things that have been added on or manufactured differently, and they're not compliant with the consumer product safety guidelines. And so check those things out. Make sure that you've got good equipment, that it's in good order, that it's built to specification, and check it out. It's not worth taking those risks and putting kids in danger that you're not aware of. So some really good things there. Counting down, we're now down to number 1. This is the top thing that we're seeing most of the time. The majority of items that we find are pertaining to electrical. And there's a lot of really big hazards with electrical, shock hazards, electrocution hazards, and real injury and health hazards from these types of things. So we really need to watch for those. But here's an example of what we see is our electric service panels. A lot of times they got their covers off. There's breakers open, there's wires exposed. You got the open slots on the panel sometimes that need the covers put on. And so always check that out. Make sure that the wires are covered and that there's nothing sticking out there that could be a real problem. We also see, inside of buildings and on the outsides of buildings, there's a lot of missing covers. That could be on outlets, switch cover plates. Particularly on the outside, there's the weatherproof flaps on the outlets. Check those out because they get broken off a lot of times. Sometimes in the parks and common areas, kids end up playing with them, breaking off those covers. And it's important that we maintain those to prevent the hazards with electrical. So always check for those things in your facilities and in your properties out there. Conduit is another thing. Not having enough conduit or having it separated, having insufficient insulation or some type of unprotected connections. Check for those things because you don't want to have your wires hanging out there and having problems with those. And the other thing we see are damaged cords. So here's an example of a power tool. We've got a drill that had been worn out on the insulation, and now you've got some wires that are starting to become exposed. That's another real hazard and things to watch for. So check your equipment out, all your tools, power tools, check your facility, watch for those types of hazards there. Here's an extension cord that we have that's running through the wall, and that brings up the discussion of, you know, permanent power versus temporary power. So an extension cord, it's actually intended for temporary use, and so it can, for a short period of time, you can run a cord over, run a tool, or run some equipment. But if it's a permanent setup where you need power run to, you need to have a dedicated line for that coming from the panel. And so check for that. You don't want to have these things running around floors and through walls, through doorway openings, you know, around sharp edges. Make sure that the extension cords are used temporarily only, and if needed, get the electrical line put in. And the other thing you'll see is overloaded circuits, seeing, you know, where plugs, there's just too many plugs put into an outlet, it's overloaded, and daisy chaining, where you go from one extension to another, and it continues. Watching for those things not to overload circuits is another thing that we see. So in summary, we've looked at a lot of hazards here. There's kind of a lot of things to think about, but really it's the top 10 categories of things that we've been seeing. And it's important that if you can take the time to recognize these things, if this is what we're seeing on the most common reoccurring basis, taking care of these things now will help you down the road. And it's the goal that, you know, maybe we get this message out and it's beneficial to our members, that they can use this and the checklist that we're going to send to go around and take care of these top 10. And then maybe in the next year, there's other things we can focus on and continue to improve our workplaces and identify things to do it safer. So there's some really good suggested things there. And if anyone has questions, we're here to help and answer your questions on that. So, Jason?
I appreciate that great information. Those are just so common, those items that Brent's talked about. We see almost every time we go out and do a risk assessment at your facilities, we see some combination of those. And so we want to do this webinar just to bring everybody's awareness up. It doesn't really matter what type of organization you work for. Those are the common things that we see, and so let's go out and take a look at those. A little later today, we'll be sending out a checklist. We modified one of our facility checklists to include these things and what to look for. So if you signed up for this webinar, you can watch for that going out later on today. All right. I don't see any questions that have come in. Anything now you've finished up, Brent, that you think you forgot about?
I think it's pretty well covered. Just take the time to inspect and address it. You know, keeping your eyes open and your awareness will help a lot. Just looking for those things. So keep at it.
Thanks so much. Everybody go out and have a safe day. Remember, we've got our 10 o'clock webinar. If you haven't signed up for it, send me an email right now at jason@utahtrust.gov, and we'll get you a link. If we get down too close to the end, I might get busy doing other stuff, so send that right now, and I'll send the link out. And if you can't make that one, you can plan on seeing the webinar recording on our website, maybe later today, for sure this week. Okay, thanks so much. Everybody have a safe day.
Thank you.